So I'm not going to be using this weight anymore because the issue is that this bottom piece, when it's sitting on the chassis, sticks down too far and you can still see it through that grill. I don't want anything to be able to be visible in this grill. We've already gone this far. I don't want to reuse this piece. You can reuse this piece if you want to. That's your call. But I'm going to show my version and basically my way of converting this. Instead of using the weight, I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to be building a new support out of styrene, basically to place these wires over. These wires are going to be serving as a kind of support here for this truck. As you can see, if we lift the truck up, we still have a lot of overhang on that truck from it. There's nothing holding this, right? If we take and lift these wires up, you can see it keeps the truck relatively straight. So I want to basically have something I can put these wires over and glue them down and then reconnect them to the board. I know it's kind of weird, but this is how I personally want to do it myself, because I want to make sure that this truck is nice and tight up here and it's not going to fall out. If there's any kind of overhang like that or anything along those lines, all it takes is one snag and you can rip that off and damage it, as I've found. So I developed this way to prevent this. So I'm going to go ahead and build a block to basically fit up on this little support for these wires. And I'm going to be making this out of some more of that styrene strip here. I'm going to cut this to size and make a block out of this, and I'll come back and show you guys the results. So I've put together the little box and I've now glued it in place permanently onto the shell, and then the wires are just basically tack glued to this. And the reason for this, also I taped the coater down too, because it was trying to kind of flop around. It was preventing the shell from going on properly. But the reason I did this, again, as I mentioned, is because the weight has this little bulge at the bottom, which would be really hard to cut off, and you can still see this through that grill, and I wanted to just go ahead and get rid of this altogether. I'm not too worried about that lack of weight. It's not a huge deal to me, but as you can see, after we've done this modification, we have the wires nicely tightened up here, and this helps to support the truck too. As you can see, they're no longer hanging down. The truck will still swing freely, but it's completely centered, which is nice. So that's why I did it this way. But anyway, that's pretty much the tower gear modification in a nutshell. You can see it's actually pretty simple, and that only took about an hour to do. Again, you are sacrificing the rear truck being powered, and I know a lot of people don't like to do that, so this is an optional thing. I'm just going like I said, and including this in this video because I know a couple of people wanted to see me do this, and it's part of the build. So that's it for now. I'm going to go ahead and put the shell back on and we can start the main detail. So now that we've gotten the major modification out of the way, we can go ahead and start working on detailing, and this is always the fun part. I always take a lot of care, and I like to be very precise with detailing. I like to refer very closely to prototype photos to know exactly what I need to model here. I'm not going to be modeling all the air filters and stuff and the conduit and piping on the underbody. That's some pretty heavy detailing. Maybe one day I'll get into that, but for now I want the basic details like truck details, fuel tank details. That's usually what I'll start with anyway. And in this particular case, the SD40-2Ts are pretty standard, just like an SD40-2. The fuel tank layout is pretty much the same. They have the little block there. They have two drain, basically splash guards on the bottom of the tank. In this particular case, the locomotive has the little box there, which we'll add from styrene. It has the strip, and then the other strip will be on the other end of the fuel tank, as you'll see in another photo. It's kind of hard to see, but in this corner shot here, you can see that the fuel tank has a waste retention tank, and this is a standardized piece that Union Pacific added to all these tunnel motors. Well, I shouldn't say all of them. Most of the ones that got upgraded or rebuilt towards the end of their careers with Union Pacific got these waste retention tanks added, and you can see the waste retention tank sticking off the corner of the fuel tank, and then you can see the pipe running up to the sill. I'm not sure where that exact pipe goes. I've never been able to get up close to one of these, tunnel motors to be able to see that, but I know the part's there. You can see it in the photo. Again, basic truck details here, sanding lines, stuff like that. All basic detailing that we'll get to in a second. As we get to this side, you guys can see again standard detailing we have on the trucks here, the brake lines, and then we have the speed recorder cable on the conductor side, which we'll have to add. You can see the specific routing I'm going to try to replicate. We have the fuel tank pipe there next to the bell. On the rear half, I have no photos of this. I actually might. Let me double check here. I do not. Okay. The closest thing we're going to get to this is maybe this end. You can kind of see something there. It looks like there's some kind of pipe. I can replicate that. So basically right now you can see what we've got to work with. We're going to just start adding all of the fuel tank details for this project next. So these are the parts that I've made for the fuel tank based on the prototype photos. 3 of these parts are the stock Athearn pieces, slightly modified. I got the one drain bar. For some reason they only include one bar in the piping set that comes with the RTR and Genesis engines. I wish they do 2. In this case I only have the one, so I had to fabricate another one from styrene. I believe this is 15-inch styrene. I've made the 2 blocks that go on both ends of the fuel tank. I have the pipe that goes on the front end of the conductor side, and then I have the waste retention tank, which is the very important piece. This is a detail, again, that Union Pacific started adding to all of the rebuilt tunnel motors towards the end of their lives, and I've scratch built the part. The problem with installing these onto the fuel tanks of these models is that the fuel tank itself is too big because of some certain things, so we'll have to modify the way we glue the fuel tank onto the chassis later on. We won't be able to screw it in place. We're going to have to inch it forward a little bit to be able to access the tank. If we just put it on how it is now, the trucks won't swivel properly. Also, we're going to have to modify the rear truck frame to be able to swivel freely so it doesn't hit this tank. But that'll be a modification I'll show later on. Alright, so I got the parts installed in the fuel tank. It's pretty basic. All I had to do is glue them in place. So I got the drain bar in place. I have the strip at the bottom, and then the block on the rear end here. On the front end, I got the pipe installed, the block, and the bar there at the bottom. The only detail I did not install yet is the waste retention tank, and my idea here is I'm going to paint this piece and then keep it aside until kind of the final stages of the build, and then I'll install it. I want this piece to look relatively clean, like it's been replaced, is my idea. So I'm going to keep this aside. I'll paint this separate, but for now we're just going to move on to the truck. So the fuel tank's done now. I just matched the paint up. I'm using some Harbor Mist Gray straight out of the bottle to touch paint these areas, and you can see it blends really well with the Athearn paint. Once this is weathered, you won't even know that this was touched up or any of those details were secondhand added. Waste retention tank is done. You can see this detail part's ready to go. The only thing I got to do is add a pipe to it, which I already have. So when the time comes, I'll glue the pipe to the tank and then test measure it on the fuel tank and on the model. That way I know exactly how long the pipe needs to be to run up under the chassis and be hidden, so we won't be able to see that. So I'm going to set that part aside for now. Talking about the trucks now, all the side frames are pretty basic. I got these cleaned up with some warm soapy water. I always clean these side frames off nowadays because Athearn's notorious for putting too much grease on these things. So I washed them off and made sure that they were nice and clean so there's no grease on them. The thing I'm going to do to these now, all the truck frames on the model, according to prototype photos, are pretty straightforward. All we got to do is add the brake lines to them. In this case, I'm using phosphor bronze wire to make them. As you can see, I've made 4 brake lines. They're in the back there in this corner here. I've bent those to shape. It's pretty straightforward. All you got to do is size them up and then bend them to shape for the SD40-2 frames here. It's pretty straightforward. You can do this with SD45s and SD40-2s too. Other than that, I'm going to be installing those on the conductor side truck. I've added the speed recorder and it's been bent to the correct shape. As you can see, that's just a bit of wire and a piece from a fuel tank detail set to represent the cap. I'll paint this to match the truck frame and then that'll be ready to go. So the next thing I'm going to do is install the air tank piping, and then we'll be good to go on the trucks. So I have all 4 side frames prepped and ready to go. Here you can see we have the brake lines installed and painted now as well. And this is just a simple operation. All you got to do is drill the holes out in the fuel tank cylinders, the brake cylinders, and install the piping that runs all the way on both ends. So you can see that's all done. They look really good. So the trucks are pretty much done. They'll be set aside for now until we get to the weathering stage, but that's just a quick step to kind of enhance the details on these trucks. So the next things we're going to start working on is the car body detailing and disassembly and deconstruction, any steps like that we need to take basically to prep the car. So if we look at the air horn on this model, this is the one provided with the Athearn model, and it's the correct style of horn for the late period, because this horn did get swapped out. It used to have a K3 on it, standard Union Pacific horn. It got swapped out for a K5LA and painted gray at some point in this locomotive's history, I believe in 2007 or 8. kind of when it was transitioning over to its final years and the patching started to deteriorate, the horn got swapped. So the horn is correct, like I said, however it's mounted in the incorrect location, and this is something I had to do on the previous model of 6112 I made a long time ago. We got to move it farther out towards the corner here, and the simplest way to do this is to just basically go in and carefully remove the horn. It's a very fragile casting, so we do have to be a little bit careful here. Normally what I'll do is I'll take a screwdriver or an X-Acto blade or something like that, and I'll start with the base of the horn, something like that, and just pry up on it, because this is very easy to bend and we want to preserve this piece. So I just carefully pried up on it, and you can see we now have the horn freed, and we can go ahead. What I'm going to do is I'll patch this hole, and then I'm going to go ahead and start building a stand, because the horn itself as well is mounted on a taller stand than what's provided on the casting here, as you can see. So I'm going to make a custom bracket for this to sit on as well. I'm going to fabricate from that. I'm going to fabricate that piece from styrene, and I'll show you guys that. So these are some pieces that I fabricated. These 3 pieces of styrene that I've cut are 20-inch styrene, so pretty thick. Usually these horn stands are made of pretty thick sheet metal for the actual stand. It's got to be supportive for the horn, so it's obvious why they use pretty thick material here. But anyway, cut the styrene to size. This third piece is the larger piece. This is what's going to be on top of these. These are the stand pieces. This is going to be the flat top piece that goes on top of these 2 brackets, and then I've drilled a hole in this piece to allow for a piece of brass wire to pass through, and I'm going to basically replicate a horn stand later on. But for now I'm going to glue these pieces onto the correct location on the hood of our HLCX tunnel motor here. Alright, and here's the bracket installed. I've just glued it to the top portion of the hood here. I checked the measurements according to prototype photos to make sure that this all lined up well, and it does. It's pretty much perfect now. Like I said, I'll fill the hole in the roof with some putty, and we'll patch that up. You won't be able to even know it was there at one point. As for the horn, I've modified the horn by sanding it completely flat on the base. That way it sits flat on the little platform. That way it matches the correct height, because if I didn't shave all that excess material down, it'd be sitting too high. So now it's at the correct height. And if I put it on here, everything's perfect pretty much. So I'm going to keep this off for now. I'm just going to repaint this little area, fill all that in, and then later on I'll reinstall the horn. We're going to go ahead and move on to working on the cab roof now. Start adding some grab irons and stuff, and some conduit and piping.